In the previous video, I mentioned the X, Y, and Z axes. These are the lines that are color-coded and make up the grid that forms the coordinate plane. X is colored red, Y is colored green, and Z is colored blue. In the bottom left corner of the 3D view, you can see a small representation of these three axes relative to your view. So if we rotate the view, we can see that those change direction relative to our position. That way, whenever you're working on a model, you can tell which axes are going in which direction. There are three main ways to manipulate an object when working in 3D. The first of which is translation, which in layman's terms is moving an object. The second is rotation, and the third is scale, which is to change the size of an object. These three are known as transformation. An easy way to perform these kinds of transformations is to select the object you want to transform by right-clicking on it, and the Manipulator widget will appear. The Manipulator widget has these color-coded arrows that match the color of each axis. So if we want to move something along the Z-axis, we come up to the blue arrow, and we can click and drag and pull up and down to move it along the Z-axis. It's the same for the Y-axis and the X-axis. If we want to rotate, we come down here and we select Rotate Manipulator. And now we have color-coded rings. If we pull on each one of these, we can rotate along the corresponding axis. If we come down here again and we click on the Scale Manipulator, we now have little color-coded boxes, and if we drag along the blue one, we scale along the Z-axis. Drag along the green one, we scale along the Y-axis. Drag along the red one, and we scale along the X-axis. With each of these manipulators, if you click and drag in the white circle, you transform along all three axes. This works for translation, rotation, and scaling. Another neat thing with the Manipulator widget is that right now you can see that it says global, which means that the arrows are corresponding to the X, Y, and Z axes of the coordinate plane. But we can change that to be local, which then sets the arrows to correspond to the X, Y, and Z axis of the object. A good way to see the difference between these two orientations of the manipulator is to use a more complicated model such as Suzanne the Monkey. So if we hit Shift A, we can bring up our Add menu. Under Mesh, we go down to Monkey, and Suzanne the Monkey head appears in our scene. And the manipulator arrows correspond to the global axes. Right now, because her face lines up perfectly with the Y-axis, if we wanted to move her forward, we could just grab the green arrow and pull on it, and she will move forward. But what happens if we rotate her? If we go over to our rotation manipulator, and we rotate in some funky way, and go back to our translation manipulator, we see that that green arrow still points along the Y-axis. It's no longer pointing in the direction of her face. This is where using the local orientation comes in handy. Now the blue arrow is lined up perfectly with her face, so if we want to move her forward, we can just pull on the blue arrow. If we hold down Shift, we can select multiple manipulators at once. So now we have translation and rotation at the same time, and we can see that as we rotate her, the blue arrow stays pointed out towards her face. But if we go back to global, those arrows no longer line up. There are several other orientations you can use for the manipulator, and you can even create some of your own. They're all useful for their own reasons, but local and global are two of the most common ones.